Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making some waves with some new comments around Joe Biden and long-term lens around privilege and whether these long-term policies and how they work with working class and minorities.
Contributing editor at Current Affairs and co-host of Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray, joins us now to discuss. Briahna, great to see you as always.
Good to see you, Briahna.
Can you just lay this? So AOC gave an interview to DSA, and she made some comments about, she's frustrated with what she called bad faith actors on the left. She's frustrated with some of the criticism of the Biden administration and what she called people who are like leftier than thou or more socialist than thou. What did you make of the interview itself? And then we can talk a little bit about the response to the interview.
Yeah, so there was plenty to, I think, legitimately criticized in their interview. But part of this conversation has gotten a little bungled because the way that most people first came across the interview wasn't by reading the original transcript, but through another article that was written that took some statements out of context and characterized them in an unfavorable light. Now, reading the original interview also, like I said, gives you some substantive things to critique. But the statement that really set the left ablaze was a kind of out of context quote that represented AOC as having said that anyone who criticizes Joe Biden is acting out of privilege. Now, what she did say was to respond to a question that was in itself a not great question, which was some leftists say that we will get nothing out of the Biden administration, that no progress will be made. What do you say to that? And to that, she says, I don't think that's a credible position. I think that that's a privileged position. Of course, no one's really taking that position, right? The question from the left is, are you pushing Biden far enough? And that's a question that didn't actually end up really getting answered in the context of the interview because the framing was so bad.
So I have the quote here just so people can have the full context. The question was, some on the left have looked at Biden's record and his differences with the Bernie wing of the party, and they conclude that no progress is going to come out of the Biden administration. What's your view? She responds, well, I think it's a really privileged critique. We're going to have to focus on solidarity with one another, developing our senses for good faith critique and bad faith critique, because bad faith critique can destroy everything that we have built so swiftly. Briahna.
Yeah, so of course, that's very frustrating to a lot of people on the left who were told very similar things throughout the Democratic primary, right? The argument that a lot of leftists were making was, hey, let's push Biden. Let's say that our votes are contingent on something to make him a more accountable president that lives up to the needs of the moment and the crisis that we're in. Let's demand more of our presidential candidates. A lot of the leftists and Democrats broadly really respect this apocryphal story of civil rights labor hero A. Philip Randolph going to FDR, making his case, and FDR saying, okay, make me do it. And what the left is saying right now is that she and other progressives aren't going far enough to push Biden, and falling back on the idea that it's privileged to demand more, that it's privileged if you don't take every incremental bit of progress that's been made and kind of champion that, and using that as an excuse to ignore all that could be done and isn't being done, is a kind of, it comes off as kind of disrespectful to the fact that the people who are making the complaint are some of the most vulnerable people in the world who have been cut out of the more moderate interventions, even some of the significant interventions that the Biden administration has managed to accomplish so far.
And so, Briahna, then as I understand it, there was an additional controversy over defense, et cetera, around these comments. What is the as an outsider, I find all this kind of ridiculous, what is the main takeaway from your perspective around political power and how it should be used by people who are dissidents within their own parties?
Yeah, I think one of the most revealing parts of the AOC interview, and I think one of the more troubling parts, is when she was asked about her theory of change and why it is that it seemed before she joined Congress, or when she first joined Congress, she was willing to use a different set of tools to draw attention to issues like the Green New Deal. I think we all recall that her first day in Congress was spent at a sit-in at Nancy Pelosi's office, which brought an enormous amount of attention to the Green New Deal and really put it on the map in terms of polling and putting it in the front and center of the public consciousness. When asked about why she seems not to have embraced those kind of techniques so much recently, she says, I had a limited number of tools in my arsenal. And now that I'm a legislator, I realize I can do other kinds of things. And you need an outside and an inside approach. But the concern from the left is that the outside approach, which in many ways is more powerful because she has so much power with respect to her trust and how favorable she is with the people, hasn't been deployed. And it seems like she's leaning too heavily on an inside approach where she's much less powerful because she doesn't have the power or seniority of someone like Nancy Pelosi, who's always going to be there to thwart her objectives. So I think the credible critique and what the left and people should continue to push her on without exaggerating or undermining the claim is that she should realize the full scope of her power and not be afraid to use it and to lean on the people to back her up.
Mm-hmm. What she said there was, when I first started, I had a hammer. And when you have a hammer, everything's a nail, as they say. But then as you learn about other methods, you can get a wrench and then you get a screwdriver, and then you're able to add a lot more to your tools. You add the tools of electoralism, supporting other members to join. You have the tools of sunlight, and she goes on. But I mean, I guess to echo your point, if we saw the results of that, like if that was working, then great. That's awesome, right? But even the committees that she and other progressive members wanted to be put on, they were even shut down at that. So it's hard to see how the current strategy is really working. I was interested to see, though, Briahna, she put out a tweet, I think that was yesterday, where she was critical of the Biden infrastructure approach as being too small. She's very unequivocal. She says this is not nearly enough. The important context here is that it's $2.25 trillion spread out over 10 years. For context, COVID package was $1.9 trillion for this year alone, with some provisions lasting 2 years. Needs to be way bigger. What did you make of that response, both in terms of, is it a good response? Do you agree with her take on this? And also, do you think that it is impacted at all by this unfolding debate about how political power should be wielded by progressives in general and AOC in particular?
I think it's a good response. I think it's an accurate analysis. I would caution folks, though, that a lot of progressives have consistently tweeted really excellent stuff on a policy perspective, right? No one has really stopped tweeting, we need Medicare for all. People throughout the $15 minimum wage debacle continued tweeting, we need a $15 minimum wage. But there's a difference between tweeting and using power, leveraging power to really put pressure on legislators who aren't willing to go the distance. So if you're someone with more Twitter followers than anyone but the President of the United States, basically in Congress, then there's a way that you could use that text list, those call lists, to call for thousands of people to come and protest wherever it is that they can put the most pressure, to really draw attention to the enormous gap between what the public wants in a bipartisan way often and what legislators are willing to pursue. And the critique can't just be there's a better policy out there, or even you've broken your policy commitments. It should be, this is the reason why these politicians are not following through on their promises. And it bears a direct relationship to the money and influence that is coming from these lobbying groups. That's the kind of critique I would want to see, because that's much more difficult for people like Joe Biden to defend.
And you got to be able to walk away. I mean, that's the bottom line. These moderates are willing to say, hey, we're not going to vote for this if we don't get a tax cut for the rich in the SALT cap removal. So, you've got to be...
That's my favorite.
You got to be willing to actually walk away. Briahna, always great to have your analysis here. Thank you.
Thank you, Briahna.
Same here. Thank you.
Coming up, AOC Frimpong on the anti-democratic practices that are infiltrating our current electoral system when Rising continues.